one of the things that we want to do is we want to be able to measure the economy. We want to know, is the economy doing better? Is the economy doing worse? What are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And if we're going to have any hope of solving these problems that we talked about early in the semester, we need to have measurements so we can determine these things. So the first measure that we need is gross domestic product. And gross domestic product can be expressed in one of three ways. It would be the total income of all workers in the economy. Second, it could also be represented as total expenditures on all final goods or services. And finally, it could be the market value of all goods and services produced in the economy. Regardless of which method that we used, all three of those should be equal to each other. And all of these values are then calculated for a given period of time, usually a year. What are the components that make up GDP? The equation that we use for this is GDP equals, but we don't use GDP, we use Y. In this case, large Y or capital Y to represent all income. A small y is used by economists to represent micro income or an individual's income or a subset income. But for the entire economy, we use capital Y. Now you might ask, Dr. Thomas, why aren't we using I if it's income? Well, that's because I is already used, and so we're not going to use I for that reason. Capital Y is GDP, and that is going to equal consumption, so all of the consumption of consumers, plus their investments, plus government's expenditures, and then plus gross exports minus imports. So let's look at that equation. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX. NX meaning net exports of gross exports minus imports. Now, if you think about this carefully, you'll realize this makes perfect sense. Take the gross income that each of us make. So the total income that I might make in a year, I don't get it all. Some of that money I set aside for saving or investment. Some of that money is taken by the government through taxes, and they use that for two things. One, they use it to give other people money, so it's a transfer, or they use it to spend money on government projects and expenditures like the military or like roads, things like that. Now, we don't want to count the portion of the government taxes that's given to other people as income. So we're not going to count the money that's given out for Social Security or given out for Medicare or Medicaid and so forth. Only that portion that involves expenditures. There's also items that we purchase that were manufactured overseas. And that's a problem, because if they were manufactured overseas, then that means that our money is flowing out, so we don't want to count that. We want to subtract that from our income. But we want to count the money we spend on goods and services that were sold to people overseas. So if we sell an automobile to somebody overseas, that counts as part of our GDP, even though somebody else in another country bought it. However, if somebody in another country manufactures an automobile in, say, Japan, and ships it here and I buy it, well, most of that money is not going to be counted towards GDP because it's not part of our gross domestic product. Now we have nominal GDP. We call it nominal GDP because it means the actual number that we get when we calculate it. But nominal GDP is not very useful. And you might say, well, why not? It's a measure of the economy. Well, the problem is we generally use GDP for comparison purposes. In other words, we're looking at GDP today and comparing it to GDP yesterday or a year before or 2 years before, 10 years before, because that's how we're going to determine whether we're getting better or getting worse. So we need an accurate representation of GDP. And the problem with nominal GDP is that it hasn't been adjusted for inflation. And so earnings 10 years ago are very different from earnings today when we realize that our dollar has been inflated by the Federal Reserve. And so we have to adjust GDP and make it real. So real GDP is GDP that's been adjusted for inflation. But it's still not good enough, because what we have is real GDP, but something else has been changing: the population. We have more people producing goods and services. So it's not really a full representation of a measure between years. So the next piece we have to do is convert it into real GDP per capita, per person. And we do that by dividing GDP, real GDP, by the number of people in the United States. And that gives us real GDP per capita. And that is the most useful of all of these numbers. So how do we adjust GDP for inflation? Well, we have a tool, and that tool is called the GDP deflator. And this is a number that the Federal Reserve calculates and posts up on the Federal Reserve economic data site. And you can Google FRED, and you'll find it. They have all the numbers and everything there that you will need. How is it calculated? Well, we take the nominal GDP and we divide it by the real GDP, and then multiply that times 100. And that becomes the GDP deflator. That's the number we have to multiply times the nominal GDP to convert it into a real GDP. Now, part of what we have to do here is we have to come up with a base year. So we need 1 year to be the base year, and then we use that number for calculating these deflators. Let's say we choose 2012. It doesn't really matter what year we choose, but that becomes the base year, and then all the other years are adjusted for 2012. We might later on decide to use 2020, but not today, because we're in the middle of 2020, and probably not the next 2 or 3 years, because sometimes we find mistakes and we don't want to have our base year riddled with errors. So we come up with a year that's been around for a while, like 2012, and then maybe in 2 or 3 years we move it up to 2015, and so forth.